All right. Um, Great. So typically at the beginning of these events, we do a quick round of introductions. I think because we're getting started a little bit late and we do have so many people on today, we'll skip over that part. But maybe if you ask a question in the end, obviously your name, where you work, if you want to share that, and we can kind of go into some of those introductions at the end. And throughout the discussion and at the end, if there are specific topics or something you really want to narrow in on, please, please, please feel free to just voice that. We want to make sure that this is as useful as it can be for everyone on. So with that, just to go through our agenda really quickly, we will start out with, I'll do a brief introduction to our speakers, and then our speakers can go with their presentations, and then we want to make sure to leave a lot of time at the end for that discussion session. And then I will also at the end give the code for the continuing education units and address any questions that are still pending. So with that, I will introduce our speakers. So we have Bonnie. It seems like Bonnie, everyone already knows you, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce you for those who don't. So Bonnie Kersch is a leader in global trade compliance. She has extensive expertise in HTS classifications, valuation, country of origin, government audits, and with all of that experience, she works across multiple industries, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, e-commerce, and has built compliance programs from the ground up. She's also worked very hard on training professionals through ICPA and CBFA. And Bonnie holds multiple certifications with lots of letters after her name, including a licensed customs broker, certified customs specialist, and a master customs specialist. So definitely an expert, and we can't wait to hear from you today, Bonnie. Thanks for being here. And we also have Tom Andrukonis, who is a leading authority on U.S. and foreign export controls and sanctions. He is a partner and the chief operating officer at ECS Advisors and a co-founder and CEO of the International Sanctions and Export Control Society. With many years of experience at BIS, the Department of Commerce, Tom has served in senior leadership roles, including Director of Export Management and Compliance Division and the Director of the Office of Enforcement Analysis. He was responsible for establishing BIS's compliance frameworks, leading domestic and international training, and was a key representative to the Wassenaar Arrangement. So Tom played a crucial role in shaping multilateral export control policies. So again, Tom, we're very thankful to have you here and sharing that expertise with us today. So I think with that, I will hand it over to you, Tom, to kick us off.
Thanks, Ann. I'm always funny to hear yourself hearing all of those accolades. If my wife was here, she would say, you don't know, it's like that. But it is true. I have been working in the export control and sanctions arena since like 1980. So a long, long, long time. And the thing I think for me just to share, because this is a great group and I appreciate the invite, Ann and Tariq and Tim to join it, is so many changes. There's been, I think, especially a flurry over the last couple of years of kind of, and specifically in the export control arena, new regulatory requirements and changes that really hyperspace kind of where we've been and where we are. Because I remember the days when you really could almost set up a matrix, kind of what are the items we're dealing with and what are the countries we're shipping these to, and the sales department could pretty much figure out pretty quickly if I need a license or I don't. Now there's so many additional requirements relative to end use and end user that you really need to conduct your due diligence on a transaction by transaction basis. All parties to the transaction really now, must and need to be screened. And you really need to, I think, rethink compliance programs to account now for end use and end user controls. And when I grocery shop, I don't like to take a list with me. My wife's different. But if you're one of those people that like to take a list when you go grocery shopping, you've got to love the new export control BIS Federal Register notices that are coming out, because it's just a proliferation of more lists. And not only kind of, bad guy lists, which they've always been good at, now kind of really adding kind of good guy lists, universal validated end user parties, data center validated end user parties, list of approved IC designer and OSATs. And all of these can have an impact on whether a license is required or a license exception is relevant to your transaction. And in that regard, too, as you look at Part 740 for the license exceptions, there are almost nearly 30 different license exceptions now. So it's critical, especially if that's in an area that you can take advantage of, to understand the parameters of those license exceptions and put them in place for your company or organization. The other thing that is true is the expansion of red flags. Now there are, I think, as many as 28 red flags in the KYC Know Your Customer guidance. And now if a red flag can't be resolved, the KYC guidance now states that a company or organization should refrain from it altogether or get BIS permission. And you've seen a lot of kind of revisions, even on the export enforcement side, relative to voluntary self-disclosures. And, when did you know? If you knew and you didn't disclose, that could be looked at as an aggravating factor once an investigation begins. So I think relative to the red flags, because so many people have different kind of responsibilities within any organization, understanding what those red flags are and how they could come into play with your particular organization are key. So I think more than ever, to train staff across the board is vitally important. And obviously, we're sitting here in late February, and so an election has just happened, and we have a new administration, the Trump administration, second administration's in place. So certainly, I think personnel a lot of times define policies. And I see that we've got two, at least, proposed new BIS political appointees, Landon Hyde for the Assistant Secretary of Export Administration, who comes from the China Select Committee and somewhat hawkish relative to China. And then for the Undersecretary is Jeff Kessler, also a bit on the hawkish side, too. Not to say that the Biden administration was lax by any means. They were extremely aggressive in a number of new China requirements, in particular relative to semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology too, just recently. So it's going to be kind of an interesting, time of transition. And as well, if some of you aren't familiar with, Eileen Albanese and Matt Borman, they're both have resigned or been asked to move on, I guess. I'll be going to their farewell party later this afternoon here in DC. And that's a lot of institutional knowledge. So it'll be an interesting transition for the personnel, I think, in the Bureau of Industry and Security in particular. But the regs are the regulations, and there have been transitions before. And as great of a Deputy Assistant Secretary as Matt Borman is, I remember when Ian Baird was the Deputy Assistant Secretary, nobody thought, how could we move on after Ian is no longer the Deputy Assistant Secretary, because he was there for such a long time, like Matt, and had so much institutional knowledge. So change is inevitable. And I think the staff there, will adjust, and they're professionals, and they will be, responsive to what those requirements are. But it'll be an interesting update conference next month, March 18th, 19th, and 20th in DC, to hear, I think, what are some of these new policy directions coming from, assuming these two individuals with their background are confirmed by that time, they will obviously present. But even if they don't, I think we'll hear from the new secretary during that conference. And I think it'll be important to hear kind of where some of the new directions are. Everybody was familiar, or maybe not, with the pause that happened on licensing that they did for about a week. Things are moving again, but it was indicative of taking kind of a snapshot of where things are and putting their arms around how new policy, licensing policy, may be directed. So I'm anxious personally to kind of hear uh, a little bit more in that regard. And as I talk with a lot of the licensing officers and some of the clients I've worked with on their license applications, definitely I'd say the Department of Defense and national security are driving the train to a huge degree, more than kind of ever before. And I think that trend is likely to continue into this new administration with these new political appointees going forward into 2025 and beyond. Um, so my practical advice would be to any practitioners out there, uh, I would definitely suggest politicking, arguing, or whatever, uh, for increased proactive kind of compliance resources. The regs are changing in large ways and very quickly, which has a huge impact in an organization to put processes in place to respond to those. And oftentimes, these new regulations are coming out in not a proposed fashion, but in an interim final uh, rule situation where you basically have a small, short period of time before they are effective. So um, to ensure that you have, make sure you have the resources that you need for your due diligence, your screening, um, any kind of training, for the staff that you have there. Um, One of the things I think is important, and I've always worked closely and spoken several times at ICPA, but in regards to kind of that resource area, is to be a member of as many of these types of organizations, so that you can network and find out more information about what is going on and what's happening, to stay up to date. Because sometimes in a hybrid situation, you often feel like you're in a silo within your own company, as you're working, export control and sanctions kind of compliance issues. So to the degree you can too, to push for resources in that regard. And as Ann said at the beginning, I am currently the CEO of the International Sanctions and Export Control Society. I'll put a plug in for that because that is the cheapest as far as the membership fee for any of these organizations that I've seen worldwide at $100. And it is a wide, diverse group of previous practitioners or lawyers or prior government folks in 5 different continents. We have ambassadors in 40 different countries. It does have a large number of benefits, predominantly virtual. So there's not a lot of travel involved. Every Wednesday, there's a session on a particular topic. There are about 8 now working groups that meet every month or every other month, as well as networking opportunities, and as well as advocacy. The society has done surveys of its members and outside to then bring that back to U.S. government folks to give them feedback as far as what some of these new regulations or how they're impacting kind of U.S. organizations or EU or other Latin American and Asian companies as well. So I think that is kind of important. One of the things we had just had organized and unfortunately wasn't able to happen is we had Tim Mooney, a senior regs writer, going to speak to the new and large Federal Register notices in December and January on semiconductors and artificial intelligence. And after he had accepted, he was told by the new administration to stand down because they wanted to kind of look at some of those policies and procedures in place. And they maybe tweaking them in one direction or the other. So we hope to have him back at a later date. Um, I see I'm running up on my 15 minutes and I don't want to run into Bonnie's time. So let me stop at that point. I certainly, at the end, when we get into chat and questions, glad to discuss any of those with you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think I'm sure there are a lot of questions that have come up from that. Really appreciate those insights. And we'll dig in a little bit more. And just to say, Bonnie did share a link in the chat for anyone who wanted to look into ECS or ISECS. So go ahead and check that out. And with that, Bonnie, we'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much, Tom.
Sure.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that, Tom. I don't know how I can follow that, but I'll certainly do my best. That was great. So I have a couple of slides here. What I was tasked to speak on today is what's in store for 2025 in import compliance. And wow, if the rest of 2025 follows what's happened so far, I think we're in for a lot, honestly. So what I'd like to do is just kind of as quickly as I can in 15 minutes, so it'll be like the Cliffs Notes version, go through what's happened so far, because I think what's happened so far is probably a good indication of what's to come, if I had to guess, if my crystal ball told me anything. President Trump took office on January 20th, only like 5 weeks ago. It seems like it's been much longer with everything that's happened, but I just wanted to remind you, it just happened on January 20th. Not even a week later, you might remember the issue that happened with Colombia over the weekend. So what happened is, again, Cliff's Notes version, a military plane with some deportees were on it and tried to land in Colombia. The Colombian president refused the landing of the plane. And in response, President Trump announced a 25% tariff threat on Colombian imports with a potential 50% tariff in a week after that. Then President Petro in Colombia decided that he would allow a plane, as long as it was a commercial airline and not a military aircraft, he would allow it to land after all. And then those tariffs were lifted. So all of this happened within about 24 hours. So it was quite the weekend, not even a week into the presidency. So that's done. We can consider it done for now. Then January 31st, we had the big announcement of the new tariffs. So this was the 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico. Canada immediately retaliated with 25% on US goods. And then there was only a 10% tariff on Canadian energy resources. Now, we're going to come back to these tariffs later, because although they were paused for a month, that month is quickly coming up. And we'll come back to it later, but you'll see that these tariffs are going to go into effect after all. The same date, we had 10% tariffs on imports from China. This is on top of the existing additional tariffs from China. So these new 10% tariffs from China were justified as responses to illegal immigration and the influx of illicit drugs. So this is a national emergency under ICPA. It's not the section tariffs that we saw in the past. So the important distinction there is that the Section 301 tariffs that you saw in the past were eligible for duty drawback because Section 301 tariffs are eligible for duty drawback. These tariffs are not eligible for duty drawback because they're under ICPA, which is in the name of national security, and it's a national emergency. So those tariffs are not eligible for duty drawback because of that. So if you're asking yourself, like, I've heard something about duty drawback here, that's the difference, because these are instituted as like a national emergency. So not eligible for duty drawback, unfortunately. So all of that was January. Now we're in February. February 1st, executive orders were signed to implement the tariffs, the ones that we just talked about on Canada, Mexico, and China, set to take effect on February 4th. Then you had a separate executive order on synthetic opioids. So this is targeting the synthetic opioid supply chain coming from China, specifically fentanyl and fentanyl precursors. It calls for the elimination of duty-free de minimis treatment for Chinese imports, which is a very, very big deal. So this was saying, to summarize it, anything with country of origin China is no longer eligible for de minimis treatment. So, and this was supposed to take place immediately. As you can imagine, this caused a backlog of over 1 million packages at JFK Airport. These packages were de minimis packages with country of origin China, and folks at the airport were like, okay, what do we do with them? Because they don't have a customs entry, right? They came through under the Section 232. So the exemption, the de minimis exemption had to be halted and was temporarily, sorry, the de minimis, that was halted. The exemption was reinstated February 5th until the Secretary of Commerce could confirm a way to collect duty on those. So that is still halted. And, you know, we'll see when that comes back around. So on February 3rd, the tariff implementation was paused for Canada and Mexico, as I alluded to earlier, until March 4th. So again, March 4th is coming upon us quickly. The tariffs on the Chinese imports, however, are in place. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Mexican president opposed the tariffs, the extra 25% on Canada and Mexico origin goods, because they're USMCA violations. Now, USMCA is up for renewal next year, discussions related to that, but you're kind of superseding, bypassing USMCA if you are imposing an additional 25% on, you know, imports from those member countries. And both the prime minister and the Mexican president have said that there will be, you know, retaliatory duties if these go into place. So the prime minister did agree to send extra troops to the border to help with the fentanyl issue. And that is what helped. That's what led to the delay, the month-long delay. All right, I'm trying to go through this fast, but it's difficult. So sorry if I sound like I'm rambling. We'll have plenty of time for questions in a minute. So February 4th, the tariffs on Chinese imports were enforced. So you have that extra 10% in addition to the extra 25% already in on a lot of Chinese origin goods. Again, these were imposed under ICPA, so they're not eligible for duty drawback. And you have many cases now. I see some of you are brokers. You're going to have to use 3 separate HTS codes. So you're going to have your regular HTS code, your Section 301 duty, your new extra 10% duty rate code. And then you could even have more codes than that if the item falls under, you know, Chapter 98, or if you have a quota of some sort. I mean, gosh, I remember the simple days when everything just had one HTS code for the most part. It's gotten so complicated. I really feel for those of you out there who are brokers. If you had an unexpired Section 301 exemption, that does remain in place, although there aren't very many of those still around. Many of them have already expired, and there aren't a lot of new, like you can't submit any new applications right now. So all of that happened on Chinese imports. Then on February 5th, the next day, we had an amendment to that synthetic opioids order. So this is where I talked about it earlier. They said, okay, you can bring packages in under de minimis from China now until the Secretary of Commerce can determine how to collect those duties on future packages. All right, moving right along. On February 10th, so less than a week after that, we had steel and aluminum tariffs reimposed. So many of you have been in this industry for a while. Remember that this originally happened under Section 232 in 2018. But when it happened in 2018, there were exemptions for Canada, Mexico, and the EU. Now there are no such exemptions. So there are no exemptions for any countries in place. This 25% steel and aluminum tariffs apply to imports from all countries. And it applies to a wide range of steel, both raw materials and finished goods. And Section 232 allows these tariffs to be imposed on imports that deem a threat to national security. And because aluminum and steel are critical to military infrastructure, that's how we're able to impose these tariffs under Section 232. There's also the argument that foreign imports undermine the U.S. steel and aluminum industries. So we have that. Keep that in mind, though, because we're going to see the aluminum tariffs at least come back around on the timeline in a minute. So February 13th, day before Valentine's Day, we had the introduction of reciprocal tariffs. So what this is President Trump saying that, a lot of our tariffs on similar goods in other countries don't match. And so we want to match the tariffs imposed by other countries on US exports. And he gave two examples in his memo. He said, for example, Brazil charges an 18% tariff on US ethanol, while the US charges a 2.5% tariff on Brazilian ethanol. So he's saying if they're going to charge us 18%, we're going to charge them 18%. Similarly, in India, he gave another example where India charges 100% tariff on US motorcycles, but the US only charges 2.4% tariff on Indian motorcycles. So if they're going to charge us 100%, we're going to charge them 100%, sort of a tit for tat sort of thing, right? So this introduction of reciprocal tariffs came about on February 13th. The next day, Valentine's Day, European Union trade negotiations. So the European Union heard about this reciprocal tariffs idea we just discussed, and they said that it was unjustified and a step in the wrong direction. So there are discussions between the US and EU on this date to reduce or eliminate tariffs on car imports, as well as a couple other industries. And the trade commissioner reported positive momentum in resolving trade tensions and avoiding further economic harm. So those discussions between the two regions continue, but we're hopeful that, we'll be able to avoid any trade tension there between US and the EU. All right, February 19th. So this, I just wanted to kind of add this. It wasn't necessarily a trade action, but we did see on that date the Walmart CEO state that he was very concerned about the new tariffs imposed on imports from China, Mexico, and Canada, and how this would affect consumer pricing. So he emphasized the uncertainty surrounding supply chains and pricing strategies, basically saying he's going to have to pass some of this along to the American consumer, and he was very concerned about this. So I know this is a statement not only, shared by Walmart, but by many, we've seen it echoed many times by various companies. So it is a little concerning as a US consumer, to see what's going to end up happening to our prices. Also on February 19th, we saw an expansion of tariff plans. So President Trump announced that originally he said that a steel would be 25% increase, aluminum would be a 10% increase. Now he said, never mind, we're going to move aluminum up to 25% as well, and that both of those would be effective on March 12th, 2025. So again, another date to keep an eye on, March 12th, steel and aluminum tariffs. He also announced on the same day that plans to increase to 25% tariff on lumber and related products. So if you're in the lumber or related products industry, you want to keep an eye on that. Also, semiconductors, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, all of these things that could take place as soon as April 2nd, 2025, if not sooner. Now, we don't have any more information on that yet, but I would keep an eye on those items as well. He certainly indicated that it could take place, sooner than April 2nd. So we'll keep an eye on that. The next day, it's always fun. February 20th, we saw more about the proposal to abolish the IRS, which may seem unrelated to trade, but it certainly is related to trade because his proposal, President Trump's proposal to abolish the IRS, says that they're going to replace those income taxes with revenue generated from tariffs, and that the External Revenue Service would be established to collect tariffs. So instead of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, you would now have the External Revenue Service. Seems a little silly to me because we already have Customs and Border Protection, who has been collecting tariffs for over 100 years, right? And they seem to do a good job, but let's see what happens. There are several people have, several news agencies and so on have reported some concerns about this plan, about the feasibility. I've seen a lot of economists report on this as well, that the US imports around $3 trillion in goods annually. And just happens to be that the IRS also collects around $3 trillion in income taxes annually. So if you do the math and you think back to, simple math, you'd have to increase your tariff rates to 100% in order to make the same amount of money, as you were making before. So that would certainly increase consumer prices, impacting demand. So, kind of waiting to see what ends up happening there, if that ends up being feasible and moves forward. All right. February 24th. So we're up to what, 2 days ago. So on Monday of this week, tariffs on Canada and Mexico were confirmed despite the border security efforts. So you may remember that I said that Canada and Mexico both sent extra troops to the border to help curtail the fentanyl crisis and illegal immigration. Despite that taking place, President Trump on Monday confirmed that these tariffs that he suggested would take place on March 4th. So that would be a 25% duty on most imports from both countries, with only a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. So again, remember, these were initially postponed for a month. And then President Trump stated that the tariffs are on time and on schedule. And Canada and Mexico have both expressed a desire to continue negotiations to prevent tariffs. So we'll see what happens. A lot could happen between now and March 4th. But as of now, I put March 4th on your calendar. It seems like that's the date that everything will take place. To this afternoon, that could change, right? But right now, it seems to be March 4th. And then yesterday, President Trump initiated a Section 232 investigation on copper imports. So remember, this will be similar to your Section 232 duties that you have on steel and aluminum imports. He's now investigating whether those tariffs make sense on copper imports as well. So this could result in additional tariff being levied on imports of copper, copper concentrates, refined copper, copper alloys, and so on. Any copper derivative products, right? So that investigation, they typically take around 270 days, but they've already said that they would like for this one to be faster than that. Section 232 investigations do have an option for a public comment period, but they don't have to provide a public comment period. So we'll see how this happens. Again, this was just announced yesterday. So that was a very quick, speedy rundown on what has happened so far. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I know that was a lot and very quick. So, as far as what's going to happen the rest of the year, I can imagine it's only going to be more of the same. So I don't know, we may see additional countries have tariffs levied on them. We may see some USMCA negotiations begin to start, some more Section 232 investigations. And definitely more of those reciprocal tariffs. So we'll just keep an eye on more of the same. Thanks.
Bonnie, thank you so much. I know when we talked about doing this, and you agreed, it was, probably 2 or 3 slides back at this point. So really appreciate you keeping that updated up through yesterday. Even that was amazing. As you said, so much information that everyone's tracking. It's a lot to keep track of. So thank you for that. I think, people will definitely, be revisiting that recording. I know I will, just to make sure, I'm up to date on everything as well. So with that, I think we'll head into our Q&A. I just wanted to share, kind of in light of what you were just talking about, Bonnie, and all of the different tariffs that are changing. I've been using a dashboard to kind of track changes, whether it be tariffs or PGA codes, 301s. I'll just delete that. So this just kind of goes through like the number of new records, the number of updates on all of these various regulatory lists, all the different PGA flags, and all the changes. So this is a messy graph, but you can see all the different regulations, all the different lists. They just keep growing. To both of your points, both on exports, this is all import focused, but the lists that people need to be tracking and checking against. And Tom, I'm like your wife. I love a list. So this is how I've kept it all organized. So just wanted to show this as kind of a starting off point. As we go into the discussion, I know there will be specific questions for Tom and Bonnie. But also, I think for everyone, the question at this point is like, how do we keep track of it all? How do we do this? So with that, I'll open up the floor, but I don't know, Bonnie or Tom, do either of you have advice on how to keep that spreadsheet or that PowerPoint up to date, Bonnie?
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of news articles, right? And I try to read as many sort of unbiased ones as I can. And I just want the facts, what happened today, Federal Register. Actually, every morning I ask Chat GPT to tell me what happened in the Federal Register. And so if you're not already using some form of AI, that can be a really good way just to get a quick bullet point. I don't rely on it for accuracy, but it will tell me, the right topics, right? And then if there's one that I want to research further on a better site than that, I can certainly do that. So I find that really helpful.
Yeah, that's I concur, a great idea. And BIS does offer, that if you just are specifically interested in an export control regulatory change or a new addition to one of the prescribed lists, they have that service that they offer, which is kind of nice. But I agree with Bonnie, having something and taking advantage of that AI and chat, it's a great idea. Because there are so many changes coming down the pike, and you're right. This topic of tariffs it is so timely, and not to put in a plug, but we are doing in the International Sanctions and Export Control Society, and Shipper will be doing a presentation for that, which is open. There's a link out on LinkedIn next Wednesday, and I think it's going to be continuing, like Bonnie said, daily. It could change tomorrow, so you got to kind of stay on top of it.
Yeah, and it looks like Michelle, you have your hand
Yeah.
up.